"Sign it," Finch said, sliding 2 documents across the desk. "The marriage papers or the foreclosure notice. Your choice, Walker." Ethan stared at both. His ranch, his daughter, his father's 30 years of blood and sweat about to be swallowed by a man in a clean suit who had never once worked a day of honest land. His hand moved to the foreclosure notice first. Then he thought of Sophie, 6 years old, sleeping right now with river stones on her windowsill, every one of them named. He picked up the pen. He signed the marriage papers, and he had absolutely no idea what he had just chosen. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't you dare look away. The morning Ethan Walker agreed to marry a woman he had never met, the sky over Millhaven, Colorado, was the color of a bad bruise, purple and gray, and heavy with something that hadn't broken loose yet. He rode back to the W Ranch in silence. His horse, a big bay named Scout, seemed to sense the mood. The animal kept his head low, hooves clopping against the dry Colorado dirt with a kind of funeral rhythm, as if even Scout understood that something had just died in that banker's office. Ethan didn't look at the mountains. He didn't look at the cattle grazing in the south pasture. He looked at his hands calloused, cracked the knuckles scarred from 15 years of hard work, and he thought about his daughter, Sophie, 6 years old, gap-toothed smile, brown hair that always tangled no matter how many times he tried to brush it. She collected smooth river stones and kept them lined up along the windowsill of her bedroom, each one assigned a name he could never remember. She was the only reason he had walked back out of Finch's office without putting his fist through the wall. Tom Briggs, his foreman, was waiting at the fence line when Ethan rode in. Tom was 62 years old, with a face like saddle leather and eyes that had seen enough bad seasons not to be surprised by much anymore. He read Ethan's expression before the man even dismounted. "How bad?" Tom said. Ethan looped Scout's reins over the post. "Bad enough." "They giving you the extension?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He pulled off his hat, turned it in his hands. "They're giving me a wife." Tom blinked. "Come again." "Finch has a solution," he called it. Ethan's jaw tightened. "There's a woman, schoolteacher, arriving on the Thursday stage from Denver. Finch says she's been corresponding with someone in town about a teaching position that fell through, and he said she's got means. Enough to settle the back payments and keep the bank off my land for at least a year." Tom stared at him. "You're not serious." "Her name is Clara Whitmore." Ethan set his hat back on his head. "She's 28 years old, and apparently nobody in Boston wanted her, so here she comes." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Ethan, you can't just... I've got 11 days before Finch files the paperwork." Ethan looked at him dead on. "Morrison's been circling this land for 2 years. The moment Finch forecloses, Morrison buys it for cents on the dollar. I lose everything my father built. Sophie loses her home." He paused. "So yeah, I can." Tom pushed his hat back and scratched his forehead. "What about Margaret?" The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan didn't answer for a moment. "Margaret's been gone 2 years," he said finally, "and she's not coming back." He told Sophie that evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while she pushed her beans around her plate in the particular way she had when she was thinking hard about something. "Papa," she said carefully, "is she going to sleep in Mama's room?" Ethan's throat tightened. "We haven't worked all that out yet, sweetheart." "Is she going to be my mama?" He reached across and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "She's going to be someone who helps us out for a while. Like Miss Peters at the schoolhouse helps you learn your letters." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "Miss Peters smells like mothballs." "Well," Ethan said carefully, "let's hope Miss Whitmore doesn't." Sophie almost smiled. Almost. "Papa," she said again, quieter this time, "are we going to lose the ranch?" He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for. It wasn't grief exactly. It was heavier than grief. It was the weight of a man who had already failed once and couldn't afford to fail again. "No," he said. "We're not." The Thursday stage arrived at noon. Ethan stood outside the Millhaven depot with Tom beside him, hat in hand, wearing his least worn shirt. He hadn't slept well. He'd lain awake most of the night listening to the wind work itself through the gaps in the barn wall, thinking about a word Tom had used. Spinster. Finch had used it too. The woman is what they call a spinster back east, Finch had said, adjusting his cufflinks, like the word was a neat filing of paperwork. 28 and unmarried. Her family's made arrangements. She understands the situation. Ethan had no idea what that was supposed to mean, that she understood the situation. It had made the whole thing sound like a business transaction, which he supposed it was. The stagecoach rattled to a stop. The driver swung down. The door opened. A woman stepped out. She was not what Ethan had expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Something meek, maybe. Someone who looked like a woman who hadn't been chosen. But Clara Whitmore stepped down from that coach with her spine straight and her chin level and her gray eyes moving across the street with calm, precise attention, the way a person surveys a room before deciding where to stand in it. She was wearing a dark blue traveling dress, practical, but not shabby. Her brown hair was pinned neatly under a hat. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder and a small trunk that the driver was already unloading from the top of the coach. Her eyes found Ethan in exactly 3 seconds. She walked toward him. "Mr. Walker," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, the kind of voice that was used to being heard across a classroom. "I'm Clara Whitmore, Miss Whitmore." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. He hadn't expected that either. She looked at him the way a person looks at a contract before they sign it carefully without flinching. "You look like you slept poorly," she said. Beside him, Tom made a sound that might have been a cough or a laugh. "I slept fine," Ethan said. "All right," she said simply. And then she turned to Tom. "And you are Tom Briggs," Tom said, pulling off his hat. "Foreman, ma'am. Mr. Briggs?" She nodded. Then she turned back to Ethan. "I'd like to see the ranch before the ceremony, if that's agreeable. I prefer to understand what I'm committing to before I commit to it." Ethan looked at her for a beat. "The ceremony's at 4 o'clock. Then we have time." She picked up her satchel. "Shall we?" He drove her out to the Double W in the wagon. Tom rode behind on horseback with the trunk. For the first several minutes, neither of them spoke. Clara sat beside him on the bench, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the Colorado landscape with that same measured attention she'd turned on everything else. Finally, she said, "How much do you owe?" He glanced at her sideways. "That's a direct question." "I'm a direct person." She kept her eyes forward. "I've been told it's off-putting." "Who told you that?" "Every man I ever had a conversation with," she said without any particular bitterness. Just a fact, stated plainly. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, $4,200 to Finch's bank, plus a separate note to Morrison for equipment I financed 3 years ago that he's now calling due. Morrison's been buying up land in this valley for 2 years. He wants the Double W. The water rights on my east parcel are worth more than the cattle, and he knows it. Clara absorbed this. "And your father built the ranch?" "Built it from nothing, 30 years. He died 4 years ago and left it to me and my brother. My brother sold his share to help with some other debts. It's just mine now." "And your wife?" She paused. "I'm sorry, you don't have to." "Margaret died of fever 18 months ago." He said it the way he always said it, now flat, contained like a door that had been nailed shut. "She was sick most of the year before that." "I'm sorry," Clara said again. And it didn't sound like politeness. It sounded like she meant it. He didn't say anything. "Mr. Walker," she said after a moment, "I want you to know that I am not under any illusions about what this arrangement is." Mr. Finch explained the situation. "My own circumstances make this a reasonable solution for me as well. I don't expect anything from you except honesty and basic respect. That's all I'm offering in return." Ethan looked at her again. There was something in the way she said it. Honesty and basic respect, like they were the absolute floor, and she had learned at some cost that not everyone could clear it. "That's fair," he said. She nodded once. "Good." The double W came into view then, and she went quiet again. He watched her take in the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the pastures spreading out south toward the tree line. Her expression was unreadable. Then she said very quietly, "It's a good piece of land." And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan Walker felt something small and stubborn push back against the weight in his chest. The ceremony was performed by Judge Harlan Price in the front parlor of the Double W with Tom as witness, and Sophie standing to the side in her good dress holding her hands together like she was at church. It took 11 minutes. The judge read the words in his flat, practiced voice. Ethan repeated them. Clara repeated them. Their voices were steady. Neither looked away. When the judge said, "You may kiss your bride," Ethan turned toward Clara and she turned toward him. And for one fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not reluctance, but something more complicated than either. Like a woman stepping off a cliff she had already decided to step off of, and waiting to see if the landing killed her. He leaned in. She turned her face slightly, expecting his lips to find her cheek the way strangers did at such moments. His lips found the corner of her mouth instead. Not quite a kiss. Not quite, not one. Both of them pulled back at the same instant. Clara's composure returned in less than a second. He would have missed it if he hadn't been watching. But her eyes were wide for that one moment, and dark, and not at all as composed as the rest of her. Sophie looked between the two of them. "Are you married now?" she asked. "Yes." Clara said, her voice perfectly steady. "Okay," Sophie said, and then she reached out and took Clara's hand. Just took it without being asked, the way a child trusts entirely on instinct, and said, "Do you want to see my rocks?" Clara looked down at her. Something moved across her face that Ethan couldn't name. "I would like that very much," Clara said. That night, after Sophie was in bed, Ethan found Clara standing in the kitchen, her jacket off. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow methodically, washing the dishes from the small supper they'd shared. She hadn't asked if she should do it. She'd just done it. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. She kept washing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure what to do with himself in his own house. "I moved your things into the room at the end of the hall," he said. It has its own window. Good morning, light." She turned slightly. "Thank you." It was the guest room. He paused. "My room is across the hall." "I understand," she said. He should have gone to bed. He didn't. "Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said. "If we're going to do this, you can at least call me Clara." "Clara." He paused. "Why did you agree to this?" She set down the dish she was holding. She was quiet for a moment. When she turned to look at him, her expression was composed, but there was something underneath it, a kind of honesty that caused her to show. "My father died 8 months ago," she said. "He left his affairs in disarray. What I had expected to inherit turned out to be considerably less than promised. I had been teaching at a school in Boston for 4 years, and when the headmaster decided to marry his niece to the position instead, I was asked to vacate." She kept her eyes on his steady, unflinching. "I am 28 years old, and I have a teaching certificate, a knowledge of mathematics through advanced algebra, a competency in Latin, and $17 to my name." Mr. Finch's offer was not romantic, Mr. Walker, but it was practical. The honesty of it hit him harder than he'd expected. He'd assumed she would dress it up somehow, the way people did when they were embarrassed by their circumstances. She didn't. "Ethan," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "If you're calling me Mr. Walker, I'll never sleep," he said. "My name is Ethan." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Almost a smile. Not quite. "All right," she said. "Ethan?" She picked up the last dish, finished washing it, set it in the rack. "I'll be gone from the kitchen by 5, she said, untying her apron. "I assume you and Mr. Briggs start the morning work before dawn. I don't want to be in your way." "You won't be," he said. She walked past him to the hallway, stopped. "Ethan?" Her voice was quiet but direct. "I want you to know that whatever else this is, I will not be a burden to you. I will pull my weight on this ranch. I was not brought up to sit idle." She said it the way she had said everything else, without drama, without softness, without apology. Like a woman who had learned that she was going to have to prove herself to every room she ever walked into and had simply accepted that as the terms. He looked at her. "I believe you," he said. She nodded and went to bed. Ethan stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the Colorado night settle around the house, the low complaint of the wind, the distant sound of cattle, the dry creak of the floorboards as the house cooled. He thought about what she had said, honesty and basic respect. He'd been married for 7 years to a woman he had loved with his whole chest, and he had not always managed those two things perfectly. He wasn't sure how to feel about the fact that he'd just promised them to a stranger. But he had promised them. And Ethan Walker, whatever else could be said about him, had never broken a promise in his life. The trouble came on the 4th morning. He hadn't expected it so soon. He was in the barn at first light when he heard hooves. Too many hooves for Tom and the 2 ranch hands coming up the main road at a pace that was not friendly. He stepped out of the barn just as 3 riders pulled up in the yard, and he didn't need to see their faces to know who had sent them. The brand on their horses said it clearly. Morrison. The man in front was Pete Cullen, who managed Morrison's operations and enjoyed the work considerably too much. He was wide through the shoulders and narrow in the eyes, and he sat his horse like a man who spent a great deal of time deciding how much damage he could do before anyone stopped him. "Morning, Walker," Cullen said. "Cullen." Ethan kept his hands loose at his sides. "You're on my land. Boss wanted to pass along his congratulations on your marriage." The word marriage sat in Cullen's mouth like something he was tasting and not quite finding right. "Heard you found a woman willing to take the ranch off your hands." "Nobody said anything about taking anything," Ethan said. "Boss also wanted me to tell you that his offer on the east parcel still stands." Cullen leaned on his saddle horn. 5 cents on the dollar. Same as before. Before that water rights case Finch filed against you gets uglier. "There's no water rights case." "There will be," Cullen said pleasantly. "By Monday, I'd expect." The threat was clear and clean as a whip crack. Morrison was going to manufacture a legal challenge to the East Parcel water rights, which were the most valuable asset on the WW, and use Finch's bank as the mechanism to tie Ethan up in litigation until he couldn't afford to fight anymore. Ethan said nothing. He was working through it in his mind, turning it like a stone. "You might want to discuss it with your new wife," Cullen said. His 2 men smirked. "Maybe she's got some school teacher opinions about water law." "You should go now," Ethan said. His voice was low. It was the voice he used right at the edge of something he didn't want to step over. Cullen smiled, pulled his horse around. Then he stopped. Because Clara Whitmore was standing on the porch. She had come out of the house quiet as a cat, and Ethan hadn't heard her over the sound of the horses. She was in her work dress, her hair still half-pinned, and she had a coffee mug in one hand, and was looking at Pete Cullen the way she had looked at Ethan that first day, calm, precise, entirely unimpressed. "Is there a problem?" she said. Cullen studied her. "You the school teacher." "I am Mrs. Walker," she said. "This is my property, and you are trespassing. I'd like you to leave." Cullen's smile thinned. He glanced at Ethan. "Pretty," he said, "for a spinster." "I've been called worse by better men," Clara said pleasantly. "Good morning." Cullen looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode out with his men, and the sound of hooves faded down the road. Ethan turned to look at Clara. She was sipping her coffee. "Water rights." she said without looking at him. That's what he was here about, wasn't it? He stared at her. You heard all of that. I heard enough. She looked at him over the rim of the mug. Do you have the original deed documents from when your father filed the East Parcel claim? He blinked. In the study, in the strongbox. I'd like to look at them today, she said. After breakfast. She turned and went back inside. Tom appeared beside Ethan from somewhere behind him. Ethan hadn't even heard him come up. Huh, Tom said. Ethan didn't say anything. She called it her property, Tom observed. She did. She also just ran off 3 of Morrison's men with a coffee cup. She did. Tom pushed his hat back. Ethan, he said carefully, I don't think she's what you expected. Ethan watched the door through which Clara had disappeared. He thought about the way she had stood on that porch, spine straight, chin level, not a flicker of fear in her face. He thought about the way she had said, "This is my property," like she'd been saying it all her life. He thought about the corner of her mouth, the part that was almost a smile, never quite. No, he said quietly. She's not. By noon, Clara had laid out all 4 deed documents on the kitchen table, organized them chronologically, and was comparing them against a territorial water rights statute she had asked Tom to ride into town and retrieve from the courthouse. She sat at that table for 2.5 hours. She had a pencil. She made small, precise notes in the margins of a sheet of paper. She didn't ask for help. She didn't make noise. She worked the way she had obviously worked all her life, with quiet, focused determination that didn't require anyone's permission or approval. Sophie sat across from her working on her letters. Ethan watched them both from the doorway for a moment, then turned away. He had a south fence to mend. He couldn't afford to stand in doorways thinking about things he didn't have words for yet, but he was thinking about them anyway. Yes. It was 2 hours before supper when Clara appeared at the barn door. Ethan was repairing a harness. He looked up. Her expression was different than it had been all morning. Not alarmed, Clara didn't do. Alarmed he was already learning, but intent. Focused in a way that meant she had found something. Morrison's legal claim won't hold, she said. He set down the harness. What? The water rights on your East Parcel were filed under your father's homestead claim in 1861. There's a territorial ruling from 1869 that specifically protects pre-existing water access rights from subsequent commercial challenges. She walked toward him, holding her notes. Finch would know this, which means either he's bluffing or he's hoping you won't know enough to challenge it, or, she paused, or the judge assigned to any case Morrison files is already in his pocket. Ethan felt the ground shift under him slightly. That last one, he said. She nodded. I thought so. She looked down at her notes. Then the strategy changes. You don't fight it in Finch's court. You file with the territorial office directly before Morrison files anything at all. You get the homestead protection formally recorded. That takes Finch and his local judge out of the equation entirely. Ethan stared at her. I was a school teacher, she said, reading his expression. Not a fool. I taught history and civics and composition. I've read more law than most people in this territory. He kept staring. Close your mouth, Ethan, she said quietly. It's not polite. He closed his mouth. Then, for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Walker laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, more breath than volume, but it was real, and it came from somewhere he hadn't expected to find anything. Clara looked at him. Something flickered in her eyes that wasn't quite amusement, and wasn't quite relief, and was a little of both. Well, she said, that's an improvement. He looked at her, really looked at her the way he hadn't let himself do yet. The way her gray eyes held his without flinching. The way she stood there in his barn holding her handwritten legal strategy, covered in pencil notes, waiting for him to either trust her or not. Clara, he said. Yes, ride into town with me tomorrow, first thing. We're filing before Morrison gets out of bed. She studied him for a moment. All right, she said, and she walked back to the house. Tom appeared from behind the feed bins. How long he had been standing there, Ethan had no idea. You know, Tom said. "I've worked this ranch for 18 years. "I know that, Tom. And I've never once," Tom continued, "seen a woman walk into that barn and hand the boss a legal strategy." Ethan picked up the harness again. "She's not like other women." "No," Tom agreed. "She surely is not." He paused. "You might want to think about that." "I'm already thinking about it," Ethan said. He kept his eyes on the harness, but his mind was somewhere entirely else. So, that night after supper, after Sophie was in bed, Ethan sat on the porch. The Colorado sky was enormous and black and salted with stars, the way it got on clear autumn nights, and the air had the first faint bite of what was coming. The door opened. Clara came out and stood beside the post arms crossed against the cold, looking up at the same sky. They stood like that for a while, not talking, not needing to, in the particular silence of two people who are still strangers but are starting to understand the shape of each other. "Your daughter," Clara said finally. "She's very smart." "I know." His voice was soft. "She asked me today what happened to her mother." A pause. "I told her I didn't know her mother, but that I thought she must have been a very good person to have made a daughter like Sophie." Ethan's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he said. Clara nodded. "She cried a little," she added. "I held her until she stopped. I hope that was all right." Ethan looked at the sky. Something moved through his chest that was too big and too complicated to speak. "Yeah," he said. "That was all right." The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called once and went quiet. Clara uncrossed her arms. She put her hand briefly lightly on the porch rail, close to where his hand rested, but not touching. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night, Clara." She went inside. He stayed on the porch for a long time after. The stars kept burning. The land kept breathing. And somewhere inside the house, his 6-year-old daughter was sleeping with river stones on her windowsill, and a woman she had chosen for herself sitting at the end of the hall. Ethan Walker had married a stranger 4 days ago. He was beginning to suspect he had no idea who she actually was, and for the first time in 2 years that felt like something he wanted to find out. The ride into town the next morning was cold. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon bench with her notes folded inside her coat pocket and her hands wrapped around each other in her lap, and neither of them spoke much for the first mile. That had become their rhythm already in just 4 days, the comfortable kind of quiet that didn't demand to be filled. Ethan had noticed it, and hadn't said anything about it the way you don't say anything about a thing you're afraid might disappear if you name it. Tom rode behind them again. He always seemed to be riding behind them lately, and Ethan had stopped pretending it was coincidence. "How long does a territorial filing take?" Ethan asked. "Depends on the clerk," Clara said. "If he's efficient, same day. If he's the kind of man who takes a long lunch and resents being given something to do before noon, possibly 2. She paused. "I brought the original deed copies and the homestead certificate. We shouldn't need anything else." "You thought of everything." "I tried to." She looked forward. "I also wrote a summary of the territorial statute, the 1869 ruling, in plain language in case the clerk isn't familiar with it. People are more helpful when you make the work easy for them." Ethan glanced at her sideways. "You've dealt with a lot of government clerks. I spent 2 years trying to recover my father's pension records from the Boston Municipal Office," she said flatly. "I have dealt with every variety of obstinate government clerk that exists." He almost smiled. "Did you get the records?" "Eventually." A pause. "I may have also filed a formal complaint that resulted in one of the clerks being transferred to a less desirable position." This time he did smile. He turned his eyes back to the road, but the smile stayed. "Clara," he said. "Yes. I'm glad Finch sent you that letter." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Let's file the paperwork first," she said. "Then you can decide how glad you are." The Territorial Land Office clerk was a thin man named Gerald, who wore a green eye shade and had the look of someone who had eaten the same lunch every day for 20 years and found it satisfying. He took the documents Clara placed on his counter, read them in sequence, read the summary she had written, looked up at her over his spectacles and said, "You a lawyer?" "No," Clara said. "I'm a schoolteacher." Gerald looked at the documents again, then at Ethan, then back at Clara. "These are in order," he said with the particular tone of a man who had been hoping to find a reason to send someone away and was now unable to. "Yes," Clara said. "They are." Gerald stamped 3 forms and handed Ethan a receipt. "Protections on record as of today. Any challenge to the East Parcel water rights goes through the territorial office now, not the county court." "Thank you," Ethan said. "Thank her," Gerald said, nodding at Clara. They walked out into the street and Ethan stopped. He turned to look at her. She was folding her copy of the receipt with the same precise, efficient movements she applied to everything, and she didn't look up. "That's done," she said. "Clara." "Ethan, don't make a production of it." "You just cut Morrison off at the knees," he said. "Before he even got out of bed this morning. That deserves a moment." She looked up then. Her gray eyes met his, and there was that flicker again, the one that wasn't quite amusement, and wasn't quite something else, and was always gone before he could put a name to it. "One moment," she said. "Then we have groceries to buy. Sophie is nearly out of oats, and you're nearly out of coffee, and I refuse to manage a ranch without coffee." He laughed, a real one this time, full and sudden, and a woman passing on the boardwalk turned to look at him like she'd never heard that sound come from Ethan Walker before. Which, if he was honest with himself, she probably hadn't. Not in 2 years. Tom rode up beside them. "Filing go through?" "Went through," Ethan said. Tom looked at Clara. "You know what you just did, don't you? Morrison's going to find out by noon." "I expect so," Clara said. She settled the receipt into her coat pocket. "Good, let him find out." Tom's eyebrows rose a fraction. He looked at Ethan. Ethan shrugged. "Don't look at me," Ethan said. "I'm just driving the wagon." Morrison found out by 10, his man not Cullen. This time a younger one named Hicks, with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove, was waiting outside the general store when they came out with the groceries. He was leaning against the post like he'd been there a while, and when he saw Clara, he straightened up. "Mrs. Walker," he said with a smile that wasn't friendly. "Boss wants a word with your husband." "My husband is right there," Clara said. "You can speak to him directly. I am not a messenger service." Hicks blinked. He hadn't expected that. He looked at Ethan. "Walker, Mr. Morrison says the filing you did this morning was a mistake. He's prepared to be generous. 15 cents on the dollar for the East Parcel cash by end of week. He won't offer more." "Tell Morrison the East Parcel isn't for sale," Ethan said. "He figured you'd say that." Hicks shifted his weight. "He also figured you might want to think about what it costs to fight a man with more money than you. That water case could drag on for years now. Years of legal fees. Years of—" "It can't drag on," Clara said. Hicks stopped, looked at her. "The protection is territorial, not county," she said, her voice pleasant and clear. "There's no case to file. Mr. Morrison is welcome to engage a lawyer and confirm that for himself. It will cost him a great deal in legal fees for the privilege of being told he has no claim." She smiled, and it was the most pleasant and absolutely ruthless smile Ethan had ever seen on a woman's face. "Give Mr. Morrison my regards." Hicks stared at her, then at Ethan. Ethan picked up the grocery crate. "You heard my wife." Hicks left. He rode hard, which Ethan took to mean the message had landed, and Morrison was not going to be happy about it. He put the crate in the wagon and turned around, and Clara was already climbing up onto the bench. "You enjoyed that," he said. "I did not enjoy it," she said composedly. "I simply find bullies tiresome and prefer to address them efficiently." You smiled. "I was being polite." "Clara, can we go home?" she said. "Sophie will be wanting her lunch." She said home. He didn't point it out, but he heard it, and he thought she heard it too, because after she said it, she was very quiet. for the first part of the ride back, looking at the road with an expression he was starting to recognize. The one where she was feeling something she hadn't given herself permission to feel yet, and was keeping it carefully behind the part of her face that showed. He understood that expression. He'd been wearing it himself for 2 years. The ranch found its rhythm with Clara in it, the way a thrown stone finds the water with impact, and then a kind of settling. She was up before him every morning without exception. He would come downstairs in the dark to find the fire already built, the coffee already on, and Clara at the kitchen table with either Sophie's schoolwork or the ranch's account ledgers, or twice a medical text she had apparently packed in her trunk alongside her teaching materials. She ate quickly, she worked steadily. She did not complain about anything. What she did do on the 8th morning was walk into the barn while he was treating a cut on one of the mares and say, "Your account books are wrong." He looked up. "What?" "Your account books." She was holding the ledger. "The entry for the October feed purchase is listed twice, and you've been paying Morrison's equipment note at a higher interest rate than what's written in the original agreement. Someone changed the rate in the bank's copy, and nobody caught it." Ethan straightened up slowly. "Changed it?" "By 2%. Over 3 years, that adds up to a considerable overpayment." She set the ledger on the hay bale beside her. "I'd like to compare it against the original note from your strongbox." "Clara." His voice was very careful. "Are you telling me Finch's bank has been overcharging me?" "I'm telling you the numbers don't match," she said. "I want to confirm it before I tell you what I think it means." He looked at her. Her face was composed, but her jaw was set in the particular way that meant she was angry, and had decided not to be angry out loud until she had the facts in order. He had already learned to read her face like weather. "Come on," he said. They compared the documents at the kitchen table. Clara laid them side by side. She put her finger on the number in the original note, 4%, and then on the number in the bank ledger, 6%, and said nothing. Ethan said it instead. "They've been stealing from me." The documentation would suggest someone altered the bank's copy of the note at some point after it was signed, she said. "Yes." "Finch," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know who made the change," she said. "But I know who benefits from it." She looked at him. "Ethan, this is leverage. If you bring this discrepancy to a neutral attorney before Finch realizes you found it, you have grounds to challenge the entire loan arrangement, including the foreclosure threat." Ethan sat back in his chair. He ran his hand over his face. He was thinking about all the late nights he'd sat at this same table trying to make the numbers work. Thinking it was him. Thinking he must have done something wrong in the management. Wondering how his father had made this land pay, and why it wouldn't do the same for him. All that time someone's hand had been in his pocket. "I should have caught this," he said. "You were grieving," Clara said quietly. "And running a ranch alone, and raising a child." She paused. "You're one person, Ethan. You can't see everything." He looked at her. "You saw it in 8 days." "I was looking," she said simply. I didn't have anything else to look at. Something about the way she said that, I didn't have anything else hit him differently than she had probably intended it. He thought about her at that kitchen table every morning, her precise handwriting in the margins. The way she never said "I did this" or "I found that," but instead just laid the evidence in front of him and let him see it for himself, like she understood that a man's pride needed room to breathe. "Clara," he said. She waited. "Thank you." He said it plainly without making it too large or too small. "I mean that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and gathered the documents into a neat stack and said, "Do you know an attorney you trust outside of Millhaven?" "Denver," he said. "Man named Curtis. He handled my father's estate." "Write to him today," she said. "I'll draft the summary of the discrepancy if you like." "I'd like," he said. She stood up. He stood up too, and they were briefly closer than they usually let themselves be on opposite sides of the kitchen table. He could see the tiredness around her eyes that she never mentioned, and the small ink stain on the side of her right hand that was always there from the pencil, and the way she held herself always like someone who had learned early that the world would look for a reason to dismiss her, and had decided quietly and permanently to give it none. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what. "I'll start the letter," she said, and moved past him. Tom found Ethan by the fence line an hour later. "She's something," Tom said without preamble. "She found the interest rate discrepancy," Ethan said. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Finch?" "Most likely." "So Finch and Morrison are working together?" "Always suspected it," Ethan said. "Now we might be able to prove it." Tom looked at the horizon. "You know what this means. If they figure out she found it before you can get that letter to Curtis." "I know. Morrison doesn't play clean, Ethan." "I know that too." Tom said nothing more. He didn't have to. The thing they were both thinking sat between them in the cold air like smoke from a dead fire, and it had a shape now that it hadn't had before, because Morrison coming after the ranch was one thing, but Morrison coming after the ranch with Clara Whitmore in it was something Ethan hadn't calculated for when he'd signed those papers in Finch's office. He hadn't planned on having someone to protect. He hadn't planned on a lot of things. Sophie got sick on the 12th day. Not badly at first, just a low fever and a sore throat that made her quiet in a way that was wrong for a 6-year-old. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed after supper and felt her forehead and felt his stomach drop the way it always did when Sophie was sick, because he had watched his wife die of a fever that started quietly and turned fast. And no matter how many times Tom told him that children got fevers all the time, and it was different, he could not stop his body from going cold when he felt the heat in his daughter's skin. Clara appeared in the doorway of Sophie's room. She had a basin of water and a cloth and a small dark bottle he didn't recognize. "Move, please," she said. Not unkindly, practically. He moved. She sat on the edge of the bed where he had been and pressed the cool cloth to Sophie's forehead. Sophie looked up at her with heavy eyes. "Does your throat hurt bad?" Clara asked. "It hurts medium," Sophie said. "Medium is manageable." Clara uncapped the small dark bottle. "This is willow bark tincture. It tastes terrible. You have to be brave." "How terrible?" "Like licking a boot." Sophie made a face. "That's really terrible." "I know. But it'll bring the fever down, and tomorrow you'll feel better, and I'll make you honey toast." She measured out a small amount into a spoon. "Deal." Sophie considered it. "With cinnamon." "With cinnamon," Clara confirmed. Sophie took the medicine. Her face went through 3 separate stages of disgust. Clara watched her without laughing, though it was close, and then she straightened the blanket and tucked it under Sophie's chin with a practiced efficiency that looked to Ethan watching from the doorway, uncomfortably, like something it wasn't his place to name. "Sleep," Clara told her. "I'll check on you in an hour." Sophie caught Clara's hand before she could stand. Her small fingers wrapped around Clara's, and she looked up at her with that direct, unsettling honesty that children had before the world taught them to cover it up. "Are you going to stay?" Sophie said. Clara looked at her. Something happened in her face, quick and deep, and then controlled again, but not before he saw it. "I'll be right down the hall," Clara said. Sophie held on a moment longer. Then she let go. Clara stood, came to the doorway. Ethan stepped back into the hall, and she came out and pulled the door almost closed, and they stood there in the narrow hallway with a foot of space between them, and Clara's face was perfectly composed in the way it was when she was working very hard at something. "She'll be fine," she said. "It's a common cold. The fever's mild. I'll check her temperature through the night." "You don't have to, Ethan." Her voice was quiet. "I know I don't have to. That's not the point." He looked at her. In the low light of the hallway, she looked different than she did in the daytime, less composed at the edges somehow. More like a person who was tired and trying not to show it, and had feelings about a 6-year-old girl with a medium sore throat that were becoming inconveniently real. "Clara," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Are you all right?" She looked at him sharply. Like she hadn't expected the question. Like she hadn't expected him to see through the composure even slightly. "I'm fine," she said. "That's what I said when you told me I looked like I hadn't slept," he said. And we both knew it wasn't entirely true. Her lips pressed together. For a moment, she was perfectly still, and he could see her deciding the way she always decided things deliberately and privately before she said anything out loud. "She asked me last week," Clara said, "what I used to do at Christmas in Boston." She kept her voice even. "I told her about the caroling and the candles and the spiced cider, and she said—" A pause. She said, "Maybe we can do that here." Another pause. Like it was simple. Like here was just the natural place for those things to happen. Ethan said nothing. "I have been very careful," Clara said, "not to want things I don't have the right to want." "And what if you have the right?" he said. She looked at him. Her gray eyes in the low light were darker than usual, and very direct and completely unguarded in a way he had not seen from her before, and it lasted exactly 3 seconds before she pulled the composure back into place like a curtain. "Good night, Ethan," she said. She went to check on Sophie. He stood in the hallway alone and thought about 3 seconds and the things that could live inside them, and the particular kind of ache that came from standing very close to something and not yet knowing if you were allowed to reach for it. The letter to Curtis went out on Thursday. On Friday, Cullen came back. This time he didn't come to the yard. He came to the south fence line where Ethan and one of his hands, a young man named Davis, were working on a split rail. Cullen had 2 men with him again, and his expression was different from the last visit, less pleasant, more purposeful. "Walker," he said, "Mr. Morrison would like to discuss the interest rate matter." Ethan's hands went still on the fence rail. He kept his face blank. "Don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Cullen said. "I think your wife went through your books and found something she shouldn't have been looking for." He paused. "Mr. Morrison isn't angry. He understands that a new bride wants to be useful. He'd just like the document returned." "There's no document to return," Ethan said. Cullen looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then he said very quietly, "Mr. Morrison's patience isn't unlimited, Walker. Neither is his goodwill toward the people living on that ranch. The people living on that ranch. Not Ethan, not the property. The people." Ethan held Cullen's gaze and felt something go cold and hard in his chest. "You ride off my land," he said. "Right now. And you tell Morrison that the next time he sends someone onto my property to threaten my family, I won't be as polite about it." Cullen smiled thinly. He looked once more at Ethan, then toward the direction of the main house, then back. It was a look that was meant to be a message, and it was. He rode off. Ethan turned to Davis. "Ride back to the house. Don't run, don't alarm anyone. Just stay close today." Davis looked at him. "Yes, sir." Ethan gripped the fence rail and stood there for a moment after Davis rode away. The cold Colorado wind came across the pasture and hit him full in the face, and he let it because he needed something to stand against while he worked through the thing Cullen had just told him without saying it. Morrison knew about the documents, which meant someone had told him. Which meant there was someone in Millhaven watching the W. Someone who knew what Clara had found. Someone who had been close enough or connected enough to know that a woman who had been in this valley for 12 days had just become the most dangerous person to Morrison's interests in the entire county. He turned his horse toward home. He rode faster than he should have. He needed to get back to Clara. He was not going to examine too closely why that thought came first, before the land, before the legal strategy, before everything else. He just rode. She was in the kitchen when he came in, standing at the counter with Sophie on a stool beside her. The 2 of them apparently in the middle of a reading lesson, with a primer open on the counter. Sophie was sounding out a word with great concentration, her brow furrowed, her finger moving under the letters. Clara looked up when Ethan came in. She read his face in less than a second. "Sophie," she said without changing her tone at all, "why don't you practice that page on your own for a few minutes? I need to talk to your papa." Sophie looked between them. She had her mother's instinct for the temperature of a room. "Is something bad happening?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Clara said. "Read the page. If you get through all of it, cinnamon toast." Sophie looked at her, then at Ethan, then apparently deciding that cinnamon toast was a fair trade for not knowing what the adults were talking about. She bent her head back over the primer. Clara walked past Ethan into the hallway. He followed and pulled the door closed behind him. "Cullen came to the south fence," he said. Her expression didn't change. "Morrison knows about the documents." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Someone in town. Has to be. Someone who knew you'd been to the land office. Someone connected to Finch." Clara pressed her lips together. She was thinking he could see it the way her eyes went inward for a moment. "The clerk," she said. "Gerald. He saw the filing. And he would have if Finch asked him what business had come through the office in the past week." "Gerald's Finch's cousin," Ethan said. Clara closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "Of course he is, Clara." He kept his voice steady. "Cullen mentioned the people on the ranch, not the land. He made sure I knew the difference." The words landed the way he'd known they would. She straightened fractionally, which was the Clara Whitmore equivalent of someone else going pale. "All right," she said. Her voice was very controlled. "The letter to Curtis, is it already on the stage?" "Thursday's stage, yes." "Then it's too late for Morrison to intercept it." She was moving through it methodically. He could see her doing it the way she moved through everything one piece at a time, no wasted motion. "He can threaten. He can intimidate. But if Curtis has the discrepancy in writing from a client of record, Morrison can't make it disappear." She looked at him. "We hold. We don't bend. We don't give him anything." "And if he decides intimidation isn't enough," Ethan said. She held his gaze. "Then we deal with that," she said, "when it comes." He looked at her, this woman who had come to his ranch 2 weeks ago as a stranger in a blue traveling dress with a firm handshake and $17 and a working knowledge of territorial water law, and he felt something shift in him, the way tectonic things shift, deep and slow and permanent. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're going to say." Her voice was soft but firm. "And I need you to not say it yet. Because if you say it, and then something happens to the ranch or to—" She stopped, collected herself. "Let's win first, then say things." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. She nodded, turned toward the kitchen door. "Clara." She stopped. He waited until she turned back. "Whatever happens with the ranch," he said carefully, "you should know that you are not a temporary solution. I want you to know that." She looked at him. The composure was still there, but something behind it was very still, like water after a stone drops in just before the ripples start. "Win first," she said again, but her voice was different this time. Softer, like something she was saying to herself as much as to him. She went back to Sophie and the reading primer and the promise of cinnamon toast. Ethan stood in the hallway and realized with the sudden certainty of a man who has been walking slowly toward something without knowing it, that he had stopped thinking about this as an arrangement somewhere around the 8th day. He just hadn't admitted it yet. And now Morrison's men were riding his fence line, which meant he was running out of time to be slow about anything. The letter from Curtis arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days after Ethan sent it. Clara was at the kitchen table when Tom brought it in from the stage depot, still in her apron. Sophie's arithmetic spread across one end of the table, and the ranch's feed cost calculations spread across the other. She had a system schoolwork on the left ranch, work on the right, her coffee in the middle. And it had evolved so naturally in the past 3 weeks that Ethan sometimes forgot it hadn't always been there. He opened the letter standing up. Read it once. Read it again. "Well," Clara said. He set it down on the table in front of her. She read it. He watched her face. Curtis had confirmed it. The interest rate alteration was real, documented, and in Curtis's professional opinion, prosecutable. He had already contacted a colleague at the territorial attorney's office in Denver. He needed Ethan in Denver within the week with the original loan documents and Clara's written summary, which Curtis called, and Ethan saw Clara's expression shift almost imperceptibly when she read this part, the most clearly reasoned legal analysis I have received from a non-attorney in 20 years of practice. She set the letter down. Denver, she said. Thursday stage, Ethan said. I'd be gone 4, maybe 5 days. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking not about herself. He knew her well enough now to know that, but about the ranch. About what 4 days without him meant, with Morrison's men riding the fence line. I'll be here, she said. Clara. Tom is here. Davis is here. She looked at him steadily. Ethan, you have to go. This is the evidence that takes Finch and Morrison apart. You can't send someone else. I know that. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Which was something he did now when he needed to talk to her seriously. Came to her level, which was not a thing he had ever thought much about, until he noticed that she seemed to breathe differently when he did it. I'm not worried about the ranch. She waited. I'm worried about you, he said. And Sophie. She held his gaze. The thing that always moved behind her eyes when he said something like that, something private and carefully kept moved again. We'll be careful, she said. That's not the same as safe. No, she agreed. It's not. She folded her hands on the table. But Ethan, if you don't go to Denver, there is no safe. Morrison takes the ranch. Sophie loses her home. And all of this. She gestured between the two of them with one hand. A small, unguarded gesture that she seemed not to notice she'd made. All of this is for nothing. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. I leave Thursday morning, he said. I want Tom armed. I want Davis sleeping in the bunkhouse and not riding out alone. And I want you to promise me something. What? If Cullen or any of Morrison's men come onto this property while I'm gone, he said, you don't go out to meet them. You don't talk to them. You send Davis for the sheriff and you stay inside with Sophie. She opened her mouth. Clara. She closed it, looked at him. Something in her expression said she wanted to argue the point, and had decided this one time not to. All right, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said. I agreed to it. I didn't agree to like it. He left Thursday. He kissed Sophie on the top of her head at the door, and she wrapped both arms around his neck and said, Hurry back, Papa, in her serious way, and he held on a beat longer than he needed to. Then he turned to Clara, who was standing 2 feet away, with her hands clasped together in front of her apron, and the morning light was doing something to her face that he didn't have time to think about. 4 days, he said. I know. He picked up his bag, stopped, turned back. Clara. He reached out and put his hand briefly on her arm, just his hand on the sleeve of her dress above the elbow, and it was the most deliberate thing he had done since he'd married her, and they both knew it. Thank you. For all of it. She looked at his hand on her arm. Then at his face. Her gray eyes were very direct, and for one moment completely unguarded. Come back safe, she said. He rode out. He did not look back because he knew if he did, he would find a reason to stay, and he couldn't afford the reason. The first 2 days without him were quiet. Too quiet. Clara worked. She always worked, that hadn't changed, but there was a different quality to it now, a kind of focused intensity that Sophie seemed to pick up on because she stayed close and didn't wander the way she usually did. On the second evening, Tom came to the back door. Rider on the South Ridge, he said, just watching, Morrison's brand. Clara set down her pencil. How long? Hour, maybe. All right, she said. Keep Davis on the north side. If he comes down, we get the sheriff. Tom nodded, looked at her. You're doing fine, Mrs. Walker. I know, she said, which made Tom laugh despite himself and go back out. She went back to her work, but she moved her chair slightly so she could see the window. Ethan came back on the 5th day, not the 4th. Clara was at the barn with Tom looking at a mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg since morning when she heard Scout's hooves on the road and felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized had been pulled tight. She turned around. Ethan rode into the yard, and even from 50 feet away, she could see something was different. He was holding himself more carefully than he usually did, and his face when he pulled Scout up and dismounted had a tight, controlled quality that she recognized as a man working to manage pain. She walked toward him. "What happened?" "I'm fine," he said. "Ethan." She stopped in front of him. She looked at the way he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body, the way he'd favored his right side dismounting. "What happened?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "There's a cut on my side, from 2 nights ago. It's not inside," she said. "Now." "Clara, I need to talk to Tom about—" "Tom can wait." Her voice was very calm and completely immovable. "Inside." He went inside. He had been ambushed on the road outside of Pueblo heading back from Denver by 2 men she didn't recognize from his description, hired men, not Morrison's regulars, which was worse because it meant Morrison was escalating beyond his own people. They had come out of a dry creek bed on each side of the road, and the only reason it wasn't worse was that Scout had shied left at exactly the wrong moment for one of them throwing off his aim, and Ethan had gotten off his horse and behind a boulder before the second shot. One of them had come close enough for a knife. The cut on Ethan's left side was 4 inches long, shallow but dirty from 2 days of riding, and when Clara cleaned it at the kitchen table with him sitting backwards on a chair, she could feel from the tension in his back that it hurt significantly more than he was admitting. "Hold still," she said. "I am holding still." "You are flinching. There's a difference between flinching and—" He stopped. She pressed the cloth against the wound again. "That's not fair," he said. "I'm sorry." She meant it. She pressed more gently and felt him exhale slowly. Sophie was upstairs, having been sent there with a book and a firmness that had not invited discussion. Clara had needed her out of the room before she dealt with the wound, partly for Sophie's sake, and partly because she could not afford to have her hands shaking while she worked. They were not shaking. She was very proud of that. "Curtis came through," Ethan said while she worked. "The territorial attorney's office is opening a formal investigation. Finch is named in it. Morrison is named in it." He paused. "It's going to take months, but it's official now. They can't make it go away." "Good," Clara said. There's a hold on the foreclosure proceedings. The attorney filed an emergency injunction based on the fraudulent interest rate." He winced slightly. "We have time, Clara. Real time." She tied off the bandage. Put her hand flat against his back for 1 moment, steadying, she told herself, checking that the bandage lay flat, and then removed it. "You should have told me immediately when you rode in," she said. "I didn't want you to worry." She came around to face him. He was sitting on the backwards chair looking up at her with the tired, honest face of a man who had ridden hard for 5 days and been ambushed and was trying not to show that any of it had rattled him. "Ethan Walker," she said, "I have been worried for 5 days. I was worried when you were 2 hours late. I was worried every time Tom told me there was a rider on the ridge. I was worried this morning when I heard hooves and counted the seconds until I knew it was Scout." She kept her voice controlled, but she let it be direct because she was very tired of not being direct. "The time to hide things from me was before I started caring what happened to you. That time has passed." He looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet. "When did that happen?" he said. His voice was low. "Approximately the 8th day," she said. "When you laughed in the kitchen. It caught me off guard." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something open and undefended, the way a room looks when all the windows are unlocked at once. He reached out and took her hand, not reaching for it gradually, not giving her time to move away, just took it, her hand in both of his, the way a man reaches for something he's decided he's done waiting to reach for. "Clara," he said. "We said win first," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "We won," he said. "Curtis filed today." She looked at him, at his hands around hers, at his face, which was the most honest thing she had looked at in a very long time. "You're injured," she said. "It's a scratch. It is categorically not a scratch." "Clara." His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. "Let me say the thing." She was quiet. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I knew how to love Margaret. I knew every part of that. And then she was gone, and I thought that was the only time I would know how." He paused. His jaw worked. "And then you came down the steps of that stagecoach and looked at me like I was a contract you were considering. And God help me, Clara, I thought. That is someone who sees exactly what's in front of her. And every day since then, you have shown me that I was right. And I have been standing in doorways, watching you, and telling myself it was too soon, and it was too strange, and you deserved better than a man with a mortgaged ranch and a grieving daughter and nothing to offer." "Stop," she said. He stopped. "That is," she said carefully, "the most ridiculous thing you have said to me. And you said that I slept fine." He looked at her. Then he laughed, surprised, the same laugh she had first heard in the kitchen, that had done something irreversible to her, and she felt it all the way through. "You have offered," she said quieter, "a home. A child who named her rocks and took my hand without being asked. Work that means something. Honesty." She paused. "That is considerably more than nothing." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to move, and pressed his forehead against hers. Just that. His forehead against hers, and his hands still holding her hand, and the kitchen quiet around them. She closed her eyes. Neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually did. Then Sophie's voice came from the top of the stairs. "Is Papa home? I heard laughing." Clara pulled back. Ethan released her hand. She pressed her lips together, and he pressed his, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table, like two people who have been caught at something and are not entirely sorry about it. "Yes," Clara called up the stairs, her voice perfectly composed. "Your papa is home, and he is fine. Come down." Sophie came thundering down the stairs with the particular enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who had been patient for approximately as long as she was capable of being, and she launched herself at Ethan from the 3rd step in a way that made him grunt and grab his left side. "Gently," Clara said sharply. Sophie froze, looked at Clara, looked at her father. "Are you hurt, Papa?" "Just a little," he said. You're nothing Clara didn't fix." Sophie looked at Clara. Then, with the simple decisiveness that was her primary characteristic, she transferred herself from Ethan and put her arms around Clara instead. Clara stood very still for 1 second. Then she put both arms around Sophie and held her, and her eyes went briefly privately to Ethan over the top of Sophie's head. He was looking at her with an expression she had no category for. It was too large for any single word. She looked away first. 2 hours later, after supper, after Sophie was in bed, after Tom had been debriefed and Davis sent on watch, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch again. This was their place, she had understood for a while now. The porch and the dark, and the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. It was where they were most honest with each other, which was probably because there was nothing to look at but the dark, and in the dark, all the careful expressions were harder to maintain. "Morrison sent those men," Ethan said. "In Pueblo. He knew my route." "Someone told him," Clara said. "The clerk again, or someone at the stage office." "Probably," he exhaled. "He's not going to stop Clara, even with the investigation. Men like Morrison don't stop because of legal proceedings. They stop when they run out of options." "I know," she said. "Which means," he paused, "I need you to be more careful than you have been. I need you to tell me if anything feels wrong. I need—" He stopped. Tried again. "I have not had anyone in this house that I was afraid for," he said, "in a long time. And I find that I am not—" I don't handle it the same way I handle everything else." She looked at him sideways in the dark. "What way do you handle it?" "Badly," he said frankly. "I rode home 2 hours faster than I should have with a 4-inch cut in my side because I needed to make sure you were here." She was quiet. "That probably sounds—" "No," she said. "It doesn't." She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "When Tom told me there was a rider on the ridge that second night, I thought about going out to deal with it myself. I had made it as far as the door." He turned to look at her. "Then I thought about what you'd asked me to promise," she said. "So I stopped." She paused. "That probably sounds unlike me." "A little," he admitted. "I found," she said carefully, "that I wanted to keep the promise more than I wanted to handle the situation myself, which was unexpected." She looked at the dark. "I don't think I have ever wanted to keep a promise to someone more than I wanted to do what I thought was right." "And which of us is that about?" he asked. "The promise or the person?" She turned to look at him. "The person," she said quietly. He reached out in the dark and found her hand, and this time she gave it to him without hesitation, and they stood there on the porch of the Double W Ranch, with the Colorado night enormous around them, and Morrison's shadow still on the land, and a legal investigation in Denver, and a healing knife wound, and a sleeping 6-year-old upstairs. And none of that made the warmth of her hand in his any less real. "Win first," he said after a while. "We won," she said. "Then I would like it," he said, "to try this properly. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes." He paused. "If you want that." She was quiet for long enough that he started to think he'd misread everything. Then she said, "I brought 17 books in my trunk." He blinked. "What?" "When I came here, I packed 17 books, which is what a person brings when they think they're going to be very lonely." She looked at him. "I have not opened a single one." He understood what she was saying. He felt it move through him like heat from a fire. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "To whatever you were going to ask." "Yes." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly, deliberately to her knuckles. Not to the corner of her mouth this time. Not accidentally. A clear, quiet statement of intent from a man who was done being slow. She looked at their hands. "We still have Morrison," she said. "I know. And Finch. And the investigation. And the ranch. I know all of that." "All right," she said. And then so quietly, he almost missed it. "I'm glad I didn't open the books." Above them, the Colorado sky burned with stars. The wind came across the pastures and the cottonwoods bent and straightened, and somewhere in the barn, Scout shifted in his stall, and the Double W breathed around them, the way a place does when it has finally decided you belong in it. Morrison was still out there. But for the first time since any of this had started, Ethan Walker felt like what he was riding toward was worth more than what was riding after him. And Clara Whitmore, who was Clara Walker, she remembered, had been for a month now and was starting for the first time to feel what that meant, stood beside him on the porch and did not go inside. Not yet. Not for a long while yet. The morning after Ethan came home, Clara made him stay in bed until 9 o'clock. This was not a negotiation. She brought him coffee and told him flatly that a man with a 2-day-old knife wound, who had ridden hard through mountain terrain, had no business walking a fence line before his body had processed what had happened to it. And when he opened his mouth to argue, she held up one finger and said, 9 o'clock, with the same voice she used when Sophie tried to leave the table without finishing her vegetables, and he closed his mouth. Tom, when told, laughed for a solid 30 seconds. But the truth was that the forced stillness gave Ethan something he hadn't had in longer than he could name. Time to lie in the quiet of his own room and think, without the ranch demanding something from him every 30 seconds. And what he thought about almost exclusively was the porch. And the dark. And Clara's hand in his. And the way she had said yes to something he hadn't even finished asking. At 8:50, he heard her on the stairs. At 9 exactly, she appeared in his doorway with a fresh bandage and a look that said she had been watching the clock too, which she would never admit. "How does it feel?" she said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed. "Better," he said. And then, because they had agreed on honesty, stiff, but better. She unwrapped the old bandage with careful hands. He watched the top of her head while she worked. She had her hair partly down this morning. She must have come up before finishing her morning routine, and it fell across one shoulder in a way he had never seen before, because she always had it pinned before he came downstairs. He understood that she was letting him see something she didn't usually show. And he understood that she understood it too, and neither of them said anything about it. "Curtis sent a follow-up wire," she said, smoothing the new bandage into place. "Tom brought it up from town this morning. The Territorial Attorney's Office has formally requested Finch's bank records for the past 4 years. Ethan went very still. "All 4 years. "All 4 years, she said. "Which means if there are other ranchers in this valley who have been paying falsified interest rates." "There will be," he said. "Morrison's been buying land for 2 years. Finch has been his mechanism." He sat up straighter. "Clara, if the Territorial Attorney's Office finds a pattern, it's not just the double W. It's a coordinated scheme. That's not a civil matter anymore. That's criminal." She looked at him steadily. Yes, he let that land. "Morrison's going to panic. He's going to do something," she agreed. "Men like Morrison, when they feel cornered, they don't go quiet. They go fast." She tied off the bandage and sat back. "Ethan, I think we need to be very careful in the next 2 weeks. More careful than we've been." "How fast do you think he'll move?" "He sent men to ambush you on a public road," she said. "He's past calculating risk." He looked at her. There was something in her voice. Not fear, Clara didn't do. Fear, he knew that by now, but a sharpness, an urgency that she was keeping very controlled, because she was always very controlled, and he had learned to hear the things underneath the control. "What are you not saying?" he said. She held his gaze. "I sent a letter to Curtis 2 days ago," she said. "Before you got home, asking whether there are grounds to request a territorial marshal, given the Pueblo ambush." He stared at her. "You did that without telling me." "You weren't here," she said. "And I made a decision." She kept her eyes steady on his. "If you're angry about that—" "I'm not angry," he said. He said it before he even knew if it was entirely true, and then he checked, and it was. He wasn't angry. He was something else. Something that felt like watching a person reveal another room in a house you thought you already knew completely. No. That was the right call." He paused. "It was the right call, Clara." Something in her exhaled that hadn't been visible as tension until it released. "Good," she said. "Did Curtis respond?" "This morning." She met his eyes. "He's filing the request today." Ethan was on his feet by noon against Clara's preference, but within the terms of what she called a reasonable compromise, which meant he could work at the desk in the study, but was not to ride out until tomorrow. He sat at his father's desk and looked at the walls, the photographs, the maps, the deed hanging in its frame, and felt the weight of the place settle around him the way it always did in here. That particular mixture of obligation and love that he had never found a word for. His father had built this land from nothing, had poured 30 years into the soil and the fences and the cattle and the water and the slow, patient work of making something that lasted. And Harold Finch and Gerald Morrison had spent 2 years trying to dismantle it with a pen and a falsified ledger. Clara appeared in the doorway. She was holding 2 cups of coffee and had Sophie on her hip, which was not a thing Clara usually did. Sophie was 6 and entirely capable of walking, but Sophie had evidently decided that today was a clinging day, and Clara had accommodated it without comment, which Ethan found every single time he witnessed it more moving than he knew how to express. "She wants to know," Clara said, "if she can bring her rocks in here." "Yes," Ethan said. Sophie immediately wriggled down and vanished upstairs with the particular velocity of a child who has gotten permission before anyone could reconsider. Clara set his coffee on the desk, looked at the frame on the wall, the original deed, his father's handwriting in the bottom corner. "He worked hard," Clara said. His whole life, Ethan said. Sophie has his eyes, she said. I noticed it in the photograph. He looked at her. He hadn't shown her the photograph. She had found it herself sometime in the past weeks, in the way she quietly found everything by paying attention. Yeah, he said. She does. Clara nodded once, then turned to go. Clara. She stopped. Sit down, he said. Please, you don't always have to be moving. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came in and sat in the old wooden chair by the window, the one that had been his mother's, and wrapped both hands around her cup. I've been thinking about what happens after, Ethan said. After the investigation. After all of it. After Morrison. After Finch. After the marshal and Curtis and all the legal machinery. He leaned back in the chair. I've been thinking about what this ranch looks like when there isn't a crisis in it. She watched him, said nothing, waiting for what he was actually trying to say. I think, he said, I would like to hire a second school teacher for Millhaven. She blinked. I beg your pardon. For the school, he said. There's only one teacher there now, Mrs. Dobbs. She's been doing it alone since the Kendall boy left for Denver. 200 students and one teacher. He paused. I think the town could use another. Someone with a teaching certificate and a knowledge of mathematics through advanced algebra. She looked at him very carefully. Ethan, I manage this ranch. You do both, he said. You have been doing both since the second week. The ledgers and the legal work and Sophie's lessons and the ranch accounts. He met her eyes. I'm not trying to send you away from here. I'm saying this is yours too. All of it. Whatever you want to build in it. She was very still for a moment. That is not what this arrangement was supposed to be, she said quietly. No, he agreed. It's not. He held her gaze. But we stopped being an arrangement somewhere around the 8th day. You said so yourself. Something moved across her face that was too full and too private for a single expression to hold. Sophie came thundering back down the hall with her arms full of rocks, and the conversation closed itself the way important conversations sometimes did not, because they were finished, but because they had said exactly enough. Heck, Morrison made his move on a Thursday. Not with riders this time. Not with threats delivered through intermediaries. He walked into the Double W himself in the middle of the afternoon in a good suit with a polished hat, and he came to the front door instead of the yard, and he knocked. Clara answered it. She had seen him in town twice in the past month from a distance, a tall, heavy-shouldered man in his 50s with the kind of permanent confidence that came from decades of getting what he wanted. Up close, he was more deliberate than she'd expected. His eyes moved quickly, assessing, and they landed on her and stayed. Mrs. Walker, he said. Gerald Morrison. I believe we have mutual business to discuss. Mr. Morrison, she said. My husband isn't here. I know, he said pleasantly. He's in the south pasture with his foreman. I'd like to speak with you. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she opened the door wider. Come in, she said. She heard Tom's voice in her head and Ethan's from multiple conversations telling her not to engage, not to negotiate, not to give Morrison anything. She heard all of that clearly, and she let him in anyway, because Clara Whitmore had not survived Boston and a failing father and a stolen position and $17 and a forced marriage by being the kind of woman who closed doors on information she needed. She took him to the front parlor, did not offer coffee, sat down across from him with her hands folded. You're cleverer than I expected, Morrison said, looking around the room with the proprietary attention of a man who had already been measuring things. Finch told me you were a school teacher. I am, she said. The filing with the territorial office, the letter to Curtis. He looked at her. That was you. My husband and I work together, she said. Of course. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Walker, I'm going to be direct with you because I suspect you prefer it. I do. This investigation is going to be unpleasant for everyone, he said. It will take years. It will cost money your husband doesn't have. It will involve attorneys and depositions and— It will also, Clara said, result in criminal charges for falsification of financial documents and conspiracy to commit fraud. Which is why you're here. He paused, recalibrated. I'd like to make an offer, he said. I'd like to hear it, she said. So I can tell my husband exactly what you said. Something flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to say it out loud, to make it so plain that she was not here to make a deal but to gather intelligence. Full settlement of the loan, he said. Every cent, including the falsified interest. Clear title to the W, in exchange for the Walkers' withdrawal from the investigation and a signed statement that the interest discrepancy was an accounting error. Clara looked at him. You want us to lie to the territorial attorney's office, she said. I want us to resolve this quietly, he said, so that the other ranchers in this valley whose loans were also falsified don't find out they've been robbed, she said. The pleasantness dropped from Morrison's face. Just for a second. Then it came back. That's a strong word, he said. Robbed, Clara said again with great clarity. That's the correct word, Mr. Morrison. She stood up. You should leave now. He stood. He was significantly larger than her, and he let her feel that for a moment just stood at his full height and looked at her with the particular look of a man who was not used to being dismissed by women who were half his size. Mrs. Walker, he said, your husband is a stubborn man. Stubborn men in this valley have had difficulties. Is that a threat? She said. It's an observation, he said. It's a threat, she said. And I want you to know that this conversation has been very useful to me. Good afternoon. She held the door open. He walked out. He paused on the porch, put his hat on, and looked back at her with an expression that told her he had made a decision about something. She closed the door. Then she went to the study and wrote down every word of the conversation from memory in sequence, with Morrison's exact phrasing preserved where she could manage it. And when Ethan came in from the south pasture an hour later, she handed him 4 pages of notes and said, Morrison was here. Read this. He read it standing in the hallway, and she watched his face go through 3 separate stages of something she would have called fury, if Ethan had been the kind of man who showed fury. He wasn't. It went inward instead, turned hard and cold and purposeful. He threatened you, he said. He made an observation, she said with deliberate precision. Clara, he threatened you through me, yes, she said. And he offered to settle everything cleanly if we'd lie to the territorial attorney. Which means the investigation is working. Which means he's frightened. She held his eyes. Ethan, this is good. He looked at her. He was still working through the part where Morrison had stood in his parlor and loomed at his wife. She could see it. Send this to Curtis tonight, she said, tapping the notes. Morrison made an obstructive offer to a witness in an active investigation and followed it with a veiled threat. That's not a civil matter anymore. He looked at the notes, then at her. You let him in on purpose, he said. Yes. You sat him down and let him talk because you needed to know what he was offering. Yes. Clara, if he had— Tom was in the barn 20 yards away, she said. And I am not helpless, Ethan. She paused. Let that sit. Then more quietly. And I needed to know how frightened he was. Now I do. He put his hand on her face, cupped it briefly, his thumb at her cheekbone, and she went very still the way she always did when he touched her, like her whole body needed a moment to decide how to manage it. You terrify me sometimes, he said. I know, she said. I'm told it's off-putting. He laughed brief and low and pressed his forehead to hers the way he had in the kitchen, and she closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds before she stepped back and said, Write to Curtis. Tonight. The marshal arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Cole Hadley, out of the territorial office in Denver, and he was a lean, quiet man with a badge and a complete absence of unnecessary conversation, which Clara appreciated immediately. He read her notes from the Morrison meeting twice, asked 2 precise questions, and told Ethan that Morrison and Finch were now under formal investigation for wire fraud conspiracy and witness intimidation. The witness intimidation, Ethan said. That's the Morrison visit. And the Pueblo ambush, Hadley said. We've identified the two men. They're talking. He looked at them both. Mr. Walker. Mrs. Walker, I'd like one of my deputies to stay on the property for the next 2 weeks, until we have enough to move on Morrison. Yes? Clara said before Ethan could assess it. Hadley looked at her with something that might have been approval. Cullen was arrested on a Friday at noon coming out of the saloon. 3 of his men were taken the same day. Finch was served at his bank at 2 in the afternoon, and the story Tom brought it home in full detail, having been in town for supplies when it happened, was that Finch had gone so pale when the marshal walked in that the teller thought he was having a medical episode. He's not having a medical episode, Clara said when Tom told them at the supper table. He's having a legal episode, which is considerably worse. Sophie looked up from her plate. What's an episode? When someone gets exactly what they deserve, Clara said. Sophie thought about this. Like when Danny Purcell put a frog in Miss Harper's desk and then had to clean the whole schoolroom. Precisely like that, Clara said. Ethan caught her eye across the table and held it. And what passed between them in that look was too layered for language. Something between relief and gratitude, and the particular private warmth of 2 people who have built something together and are quietly acknowledging it. Morrison was arrested on the following Monday. Ethan was there when it happened, not by design, but because he had ridden into town to meet with Curtis about the formal discharge of the loan, and he was coming out of the attorney's office when Hadley and 2 deputies walked Gerald Morrison across the main street of Millhaven in handcuffs. Morrison saw Ethan. Stopped. The deputy kept him moving. But Morrison turned his head and his eyes found Ethan's, and whatever he saw there, a rancher who had not bent a man who had not sold his family's land, a woman's handwriting on 4 pages of notes that had become the centerpiece of a criminal case, whatever he saw, it cost him something. Ethan saw it cost him. Ethan didn't say anything. He put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode home. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in. She looked up from the stove. It's done, he said. She set down the spoon she was holding. Morrison, she said. This morning. Curtis is filing the discharge of the loan today. The bank, what's left of it after the investigation, has agreed to a settlement. We owe nothing. He paused. Clara, we owe nothing. The ranch is clear. She was perfectly still for a moment. Her hands were at her sides, and her face was doing the thing it did when she felt something large and was deciding how much of it to show. Then she pressed both hands flat on the kitchen counter and dropped her head forward, and her shoulders shook once, just once. And when she raised her head, her eyes were bright and her jaw was set, and she was not going to cry. He knew she was not going to cry, but it had been very close. Good, she said. Her voice was steady. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put both arms around her, and she let him. Which was the thing he hadn't been sure about until it happened, and she pressed her face briefly against his chest, and her hands gripped the front of his shirt, and he held on. We did it, he said into her hair. We did, she said, muffled but clear. Sophie appeared in the doorway and stopped. She looked at her father holding Clara. Looked at Clara's hands in his shirt. Looked at both their faces. Is the bad stuff over? She said. Ethan looked at his daughter over Clara's head. Clara straightened and turned and crouched down to Sophie's level. Yes, Clara said. The bad stuff is over. Sophie considered her for a moment with those serious brown eyes that saw everything. Are you going to stay now? Sophie said. For real. Not just because of the ranch. Clara's throat moved. Sophie, she said carefully, I was staying before the ranch was settled. Sophie frowned slightly. When? The 8th day, Clara said. Sophie didn't understand that. But she accepted it the way she accepted most things Clara told her on trust, which was the highest thing a 6-year-old could offer. She walked forward and put her arms around Clara's neck, and Clara held her, and Ethan stood in his kitchen looking at the two of them and felt the thing in his chest that didn't have a name do something so large he had to look at the ceiling for a moment. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch together. Sophie was between them on the bench, leaning against Clara's arm, working her way through a piece of apple bread with the concentration she gave to things she enjoyed. The Colorado sky was doing what it did in the fall, going pink and copper and improbable above the mountains, and the double W lay around them in the particular piece of a place that had been fought for and held. "Clara," Sophie said through apple bread. "Don't talk with your mouth full," Clara said. Sophie swallowed. "Clara, are you and Papa in love?" Ethan went very still. Clara did too. Then Clara said without looking at Ethan, "What makes you ask that?" "Because you look at him like Mrs. Dobbs looks at her dog," Sophie said. "Like you're glad he's there even when he's not doing anything." Clara said nothing for a moment. Ethan said nothing either. He was looking at Clara. "That," Clara said finally, "is a very astute observation." "What's astute?" "Smart," Clara said. "Very smart." Sophie nodded satisfied and went back to her apple bread. Clara turned her head and looked at Ethan. The pink light was in her hair and she was not wearing her composure, like armor. Right now, she had it laid down somewhere, the way you lay down something heavy when you finally reach the place you were carrying it to. And she looked for the first time since she had stepped off that stage in her blue traveling dress, like someone who was exactly where she meant to be. "She's not wrong," Ethan said quietly. "No," Clara said. "She's not." He reached across Sophie, who was entirely uninterested being focused on apple bread, and took Clara's hand, and she wove her fingers through his, and they sat like that while the light changed and the ranch breathed around them, and Sophie finished her apple bread, and eventually fell asleep against Clara's arm with her mouth open. "She's going to wake up with a stiff neck," Clara said softly. "She always does," Ethan said. "She doesn't care." Clara looked down at Sophie's sleeping face. "Ethan," she said very quietly. "Yeah?" "Thank you for riding out of Finch's office with those papers instead of through the wall." She paused. "I know that's what you wanted to do." He laughed under his breath. "Tom told you that." "Tom tells me a great deal," she said. "He's very fond of you." "He's very fond of you," Ethan said. "He told me last week you were the best thing that happened to this ranch since running water." She smiled fully genuinely, the smile he had been coaxing out of her for 2 months, and still felt like a reward every time he earned it. "High praise," she said. "Highest he's got," Ethan said. The stars were coming out now, one at a time, the way they did over the Colorado mountains, slow at first, and then all at once the sky filling up until it seemed too full to hold. Sophie stirred, but didn't wake. Clara put her free hand lightly on Sophie's hair. "I'm going to write to Boston next week," Clara said. "Let them know where I am." She paused. "My cousin Agnes thought I was making a catastrophic mistake." "Were you?" he said. She considered it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "No," she said. "I was making the best decision I've ever made. I just didn't know it yet." She looked at him sideways. "You were also making the best decision you've ever made. You were just too busy being resentful about it to notice." He laughed fully this time. Sophie twitched. "Shh," Clara said. "You started it," he said. "I almost always do," she said, and her voice was warm with something that had no armor around it at all. He held her hand. Sophie slept. The double W held them all. Whatever was coming next, and they both knew something was always coming next, that was the nature of land and love and frontier living. It was coming for a family, a real one built piece by piece, from honesty and hard work, and the stubborn refusal to stop when stopping would have been easier. Ethan Walker had signed those papers in Finch's office thinking he was choosing between 2 bad options. He had not understood yet that he was choosing the best thing that would ever happen to him. Clara had understood it even less. But they were both beginning to now. That was enough. The letter from Cousin Agnes arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Clara had written to Boston. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Ethan was out with Tom checking the east pasture fence, the same fence Morrison's men had ridden along for weeks watching, which now felt like something from a different life. Sophie was doing her arithmetic beside her pencil, moving carefully across the page, her tongue between her teeth, in the way she had when she was concentrating. Clara read the letter twice, set it down. "Is it bad news?" Sophie said without looking up from her arithmetic. "No," Clara said, "it's Agnes." Sophie considered this distinction. "Is that worse?" Clara looked at her. "How do you know about Agnes?" "You made a face when you said her name once," Sophie said. "The same face you make when the biscuits burn." Clara pressed her lips together hard. She would not laugh. She would absolutely not laugh. "Agnes is concerned," she said carefully, "about my well-being." "What's she concerned about?" Clara looked at this letter again. Agnes had written 4 pages of tightly packed Boston worry covering, in order, the impropriety of the arrangement, the unsuitability of frontier life for a woman of Clara's education, the damage to the family's reputation, and in the final page, a thinly disguised offer to help Clara come home. Home being Boston. Home being the city where Clara had spent 4 years being overlooked, underpaid, and eventually dismissed for a man's niece. "She thinks," Clara said, "that I made a mistake." Sophie looked up from her arithmetic for the first time. She studied Clara with those serious brown eyes that Ethan had given her. "Did you?" Sophie said. Clara folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, picked up her own pencil, and looked at Sophie's arithmetic. "Your long division on number 4 is wrong," she said. "You carried the 3 when it should be a 2. Sophie looked at her paper, looked at Clara. She had clearly decided that the answer to her question was contained in the redirect and had filed it accordingly. "Oh," Sophie said. "You're right." She erased and started again. Clara sat with her coffee and Agnes's letter in her pocket, and listened to Sophie's pencil on paper, and the sound of the wind outside, and the distant sound of Ethan's voice carrying across the yard as he talked to Tom, and she thought about the word home and how a place could redefine itself entirely in the space of 2 months if you let it. She was not going back to Boston. She was already home. No. When Ethan came in for the midday meal, Clara put Agnes's letter on the table in front of him without comment. He read it. His jaw tightened once on the second page. He finished it and set it down. "Agnes," he said. "Yes." "She thinks she calls it stranded." "She does." He looked at her. "Are you, Ethan?" She said, "I am sitting in my kitchen making lunch. What does stranded look like to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to write back to her?" Clara set a plate in front of him. "I want to write that I am well, that the ranch is thriving, that my husband is a good man, and that she should visit if she ever wants to see what happy looks like." She paused. "I will probably write something more diplomatic than that." Ethan picked up his fork. "Write the first version," he said. "I'd like to meet Agnes." "You would not," Clara said. "You would find her exhausting within 4 minutes." "I find a lot of things exhausting," he said. "I manage." She looked at him. He was eating calm steady, completely unrattled by a 4-page letter from a Boston woman who thought his wife had made a catastrophic error. He was just there. Solid and real, and entirely unbothered the way he was unbothered by most things that would have felled someone with less foundation. She had not understood before she came here how much she had wanted that. Someone whose presence itself was a kind of stability. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." Agnes is not entirely wrong that this was unconventional. He looked up. Was she wrong that it was a mistake? Clara held his gaze. "No," she said. "She was wrong about that." He nodded once, the same small, certain nod he used when something was settled and didn't need more words. Sophie appeared from the hallway. "Is there lunch?" "Sit down," both of them said simultaneously. Sophie sat down and looked between them with an expression that was 3 parts satisfaction and 1 part the specific pleasure of a child who has watched 2 adults become a unit without quite knowing they were doing it. It was Curtis who told them about Finch. He rode out to the Double W himself, which was unusual enough that Ethan met him at the fence with his hand close to the rifle on his saddle before he recognized the attorney's horse. Curtis dismounted and shook his hand and then Clara's, and he had an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and not quite succeeding. "Finch made a deal," Curtis said when they were inside. Ethan went still. "What kind of deal?" "He's cooperating with the territorial attorney's office. Full cooperation books, records, correspondence, everything." Curtis sat down at the kitchen table. "In exchange for a reduced sentence, he's giving them Morrison." Clara poured coffee without being asked, which was what she did when she was buying herself a moment to process something without reacting to it. "Morrison's already under arrest," Ethan said. "He was under arrest," Curtis said. "His attorneys had him out on bond by Thursday. With Finch's cooperation, they can hold him." He paused. "There's more." "Say it," Ethan said. "Finch's records show 5 other ranchers in this valley on falsified loan notes. 3 of them have already lost their land. Morrison bought it through shell companies." He set a list on the table. 5 names. "These men were defrauded the same way you were. The difference is they didn't have," he looked at Clara, "someone who knew what to look for." Clara looked at the 5 names. Her face was doing the contain thing. The thing Ethan now knew meant she was feeling something that was going to turn into action rather than words. "Can they recover their land?" she said. "The territorial attorney thinks so in at least 3 cases," Curtis said. "It depends on—" "What do they need?" Clara said. Curtis blinked. "I beg your pardon." "These men," she said, tapping the list. "What do they need to file? What documentation?" "Clara," Ethan said. "Ethan?" She looked at him directly. "Finch falsified their loans the same way he falsified ours. The same statute applies. The same territorial protection." She looked back at Curtis. "If I write the same summary I wrote for our case, the statutory analysis, would that be usable for each of them?" Curtis stared at her. "You wrote that summary yourself?" "Yes." "Mrs. Walker, the territorial attorney, called that document." "I know what he called it," she said without a trace of false modesty. She simply knew her own work. "Can it be adapted for each of their cases?" Curtis sat back in his chair. "With some modification, yes, I believe it could." She nodded. "Then I'll write it. 1 for each of them." She looked at Ethan. "Is that all right?" He looked at her. At this woman who had come to his ranch with $17 and a teaching certificate, and had in the space of 2 months dismantled a criminal land scheme, raised his daughter, managed his accounts, and was now proposing to do the same thing for 5 strangers because it was the right thing to do. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." Curtis rode out an hour later, looking somewhat dazed. Tom, who had been lingering in the hallway with entirely unconvincing casualness, appeared in the kitchen doorway after the attorney left. "She's going to write legal briefs," Ethan told him, "for 5 other ranchers." Tom looked at Clara. "You know," he said, "when Finch said he had a solution to the foreclosure, I don't think this is what he had in mind." "No," Clara agreed. "I imagine not." She wrote all 5 summaries in 11 days. She worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after Sophie was in bed. The ranch accounts on one side and the territorial statute on the other, her handwriting precise and even across page after page. Ethan brought her coffee at 9 o'clock without being asked. She started leaving a second cup for him without being asked. They had developed without planning it, the particular domestic shorthand of people who have been paying close attention to each other. On the 4th evening, he sat across from her while she worked. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there with his coffee watching. "You don't have to stay up," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him over her papers. "You're going to make me self-conscious." "You've never been self-conscious in your life," he said. "That's not entirely true," she said. "I was self-conscious the morning you came into the kitchen and I hadn't finished pinning my hair." He was quiet for a moment. "I liked it," he said. She looked at her papers. "I know you did," she said. "That's why I was self-conscious." He smiled into his coffee. "Ethan," she said without looking up. "Yeah. I think when all of this is truly finished, the investigation, the other ranchers, all of it." She kept her eyes on her work. "I would like to do what you said, about the school." He didn't rush it. Let her finish. "Not every day," she said. "The ranch needs I won't leave the accounts or Sophie's lessons, but 2 mornings a week perhaps, if Mrs. Dobbs would have me." She paused. "I didn't stop being a teacher when I married you. I just added things." "I'll talk to the school board," he said. She looked up then. "You're on the school board." "Since my father's time," he said. "It's a small board. I'm also the water commissioner, and apparently I'm on a committee about the road into Pueblo that I've never once attended a meeting of." She stared at him. "You are the water commissioner." "Honorary," he said. "Ethan Walker," she said slowly, "you are more involved in this town than you have ever suggested." "I'm not involved," he said. "I just show up when they need someone. There's a difference." "That," she said, "is the definition of involved." He shrugged. "I'll talk to the school board," he said again. "You can start whenever you're ready." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her writing, but the line of her mouth was softer, and the set of her shoulders was different, and he understood what that meant. The morning Clara realized she was pregnant, it was barely dawn, and Ethan was still asleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the thin gray light and counted back the weeks, and then sat with the number for a long, quiet moment. Her hands folded in her lap, her mind perfectly still, the way it got when she was standing at the edge of something enormous. She had not expected this. She had told herself she had not expected this. She had not allowed herself to expect this, the way she had carefully not allowed herself to expect the things that had come before it. The hand on her arm, the forehead against hers, the name that had quietly become home. The child down the hall who had walked into her arms that first afternoon with a complete absence of hesitation that still undid her when she thought about it. She heard Ethan move in his room, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of him pulling on his boots. She crossed the hall and knocked on his door. He opened it. He was half-dressed and surprised, and his hair was not yet sorted, and he looked at her face and immediately went still. "What's wrong?" he said. "Nothing is wrong," she said. She had planned to be measured about this. Composed. She had planned to choose her words. Instead, she looked at him and said simply, "I'm going to have a baby, Ethan." He looked at her. The expression that moved across his face was too large and too fast and too real for her to follow all of it. She caught wonder and fear and something that cracked wide open in the middle and was so unguarded it made her own chest ache. He crossed the 2 steps between them and put both arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the doorway between their 2 rooms while the ranch came awake around them. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough. "I know," she said. "Are you—" He pulled back enough to look at her face. His hands were on her arms. "Are you all right? Are you—" "I'm fine," she said. And then, because she had promised him honesty and this was not the moment to start qualifying it, "I'm also terrified, and I'm also—" She stopped. Found the word. "Glad. I'm terrified and glad at the same time, and I don't quite know how to hold both of those." "Yeah," he said, his voice still rough. "That sounds exactly right." Sophie's door opened. She looked at them standing in the hallway, Ethan's hands on Clara's arms, Clara's face in the complicated arrangement it was in. "What happened?" Sophie said. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ethan. Some question passed between them in that look and was answered. "Come here, sweetheart," Ethan said. Sophie came. He crouched down to her level, which was the thing he did when he needed her full attention, and she gave it to him with the gravity she reserved for important things. "How do you feel?" he said carefully, "about being a big sister?" Sophie stared at him. Then she turned to Clara. Her brown eyes went very wide. "Is there a baby?" "There is," Clara said. Her voice was entirely steady except for the very end of the sentence. Sophie looked at them both for a very long moment. The Sophie Walker decision-making process at work. Thorough, serious, not to be rushed. Then she turned to Clara and said, "Can I name it?" Clara made a sound that was not entirely composed. "We can discuss it." "I want to name it River," Sophie said. "If it's a boy, and if it's a girl, I want to name it Stone." "River and Stone Walker," Ethan said with complete seriousness. "Sophie," Clara said carefully. "They're good names," Sophie said with absolute confidence. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. His eyes were bright. She hadn't seen them bright like that in any of the time she'd known him, and it was a new thing to look at, something she was going to need to learn the shape of. "We'll discuss it," Clara said again. Sophie nodded satisfied and went downstairs for breakfast. Tom found out at lunch. He had been watching Ethan's face all morning with the suspicion of a man who had known Ethan Walker for 18 years and could read a shift in his weather at 50 paces. By the time they sat down to eat, Tom's expression had already started to move toward knowing. "Something happened," Tom said. "Eat your lunch," Ethan said. Tom looked at Clara. She looked at her plate composed, but Tom had also been learning to read Clara's composure, which was its own particular education. "Clara," Tom said. "Tom," she said. "Is everyone all right?" "Everyone," she said and glanced up briefly, "is more than all right." Tom put his fork down. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the window. Tom looked at Clara again. She met his eyes, and the thing she allowed to show in her face was small and controlled, but it was enough. Tom sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was significantly less steady than usual, "Well, I'll be." Sophie looked up. "Tom knows," she announced. "Sophie," Clara said. "He figured it out." Sophie said reasonably, "He's smart." Tom reached over and put his large weathered hand briefly over Clara's on the table. Not for long, just a moment. The gesture of a man who didn't have many words for large feelings and had found one. "Congratulations," he said. "Both of you." "Thank you, Tom," Clara said. And her voice this time was not perfectly steady. Yet, the twist came 6 weeks later on a cold November morning, and it came from the doctor. His name was Harmon, and he had ridden out from Millhaven at Clara's request because she had been more tired than she expected, and Ethan had worried quietly and completely without stopping for 11 days until she agreed to send for him. Dr. Harmon examined her in the bedroom, while Ethan stood in the hallway outside the closed door and did not move for 40 minutes. Tom was in the yard. Sophie was at the table with her reader, but she kept looking at the ceiling tracking sound. The door opened. Dr. Harmon came out. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was professionally composed and privately delighted. "Mr. Walker," he said, "your wife is in excellent health." Ethan exhaled. "Good. There is, however, a detail she'd like to tell you herself." Harmon paused. "I'll see myself out." He went downstairs. Ethan went into the bedroom. Clara was sitting up, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at him, and her gray eyes were doing something he had never seen them do before. Something completely unguarded and slightly stunned, and underneath all of it, luminous. "Clara," he said. "What is it?" "Twins," she said. He stood very still. "Two," she said in case the word had not landed. "There are 2 Ethan." He sat down on the edge of the bed. Heavily. The way a man sits when his legs have made a decision without him. "2," he said. "The doctor is quite certain," she said. "Apparently it explains the fatigue." He looked at her. She looked at him. He could see that she was using every piece of her considerable composure to remain settled, and underneath it, She was shaking slightly. Not with fear, but with the particular overwhelm of someone receiving more than they asked for, and not yet knowing how to hold it. He put his hand on her face. She leaned into it. "Two?" he said again. "I know," she said. "Sophie is going to want to name both of them." A sound came out of Clara that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was absolutely the realest thing he had ever heard from her. He pulled her against him, and held on, and she let him, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and her hands gripped his shirt, and she breathed. "We're going to need a bigger table," she said into his shoulder. "We'll build one," he said. "Ethan." "Yeah." "I brought 17 books," she said. "I haven't opened a single one." "I know," he said. "I am never going to open them," she said. "I know that too," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. Her face in the pale November light was the most fully itself he had ever seen it. The composure still there because it was part of her, and always would be, but not as armor anymore. As simply the shape of the woman she was. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything, clearly, directly, without softness, as cover for uncertainty. Just the plain fact of it, offered the way she offered everything with her whole self, and no apology. He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. She gave him a look. "I love you," he said. "I've been working up to saying it since the 8th day, and you beat me to it." "I beat you to most things," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You do." Sophie took the news about twins with the composure of a person who had already decided she was capable of handling anything. "2 babies," she said at supper as if confirming a math problem. "So I need 2 names." "Sophie," Clara started. "River," Sophie said, "and Stone." "Sweetheart?" Ethan said, "We talked about this." "River and Stone Walker," Sophie said firmly. "They're good names. They'll be strong." Clara looked at Ethan. He pressed his lips together. She pressed hers. This had become something they did, the shared effort of not laughing in front of Sophie when Sophie was being entirely serious, and it was its own private language. "We will," Clara said carefully, "take them under serious consideration." Sophie nodded. "Good." She picked up her fork. "Tom says twins are good luck." "When did you talk to Tom about this?" Ethan said. "This afternoon," Sophie said. "He was crying a little, but he said it was dust." "It's November," Clara said. "I know," Sophie said. "There wasn't any dust." The spring that followed was the best one the WW had seen in years. The cattle were healthy. The east pasture, with its water rights formally protected and recorded at the territorial office, yielded well. Tom hired 2 new hands, and didn't have to let either of them go after the season. Clara started her 2 mornings a week at the Millhaven school, and Mrs. Dobbs, who had been prepared to be territorial about it, was within a month asking if she could perhaps make it 3. Curtis sent word in March that the last of the 5 defrauded ranchers had recovered their land through the territorial proceeding. All 5. Clara had written all 5 summaries. All 5 had worked. Ethan told her at the kitchen table, and she said, "Good," and went back to the ledgers, and he watched her write in her even, precise hand, and thought about a woman who had arrived at a stage depot with a firm handshake and $17, and had quietly, methodically changed everything around her. He still wasn't sure she entirely knew she'd done it. He was pretty sure she did, but preferred not to make a production of it. The twins arrived on a warm June morning. Clara was strong throughout. The doctor said it twice, with what sounded like genuine surprise, and Clara said, "I've been told I'm capable," in a voice that was slightly strained by circumstance, but entirely composed. And when it was done, and Ethan was holding 2 very small, very loud people, 1 in each arm, he looked at Clara in the bed, pale and exhausted, and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, and found he had nothing to say. So he sat on the edge of the bed and put both of them carefully in her arms, and she looked down at them, and her face went somewhere he had never seen it go, somewhere completely undefended, open all the way down, every wall and every armor set aside. Sophie appeared in the doorway. She had been waiting in the hall with Tom, who was apparently crying again, and had already tried the dust excuse twice. "Can I see?" Sophie whispered. "Come in," Clara said. Her voice was soft. Sophie came to the bed and looked at the two small faces. She was very quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Which one is River, and which one is Stone?" Clara looked at Ethan. He looked at Clara. "That one," Clara said, nodding toward the one on the left, "is Benjamin. And this one is Rose." Sophie studied them. "Those are also good names," she said with generous concession. "Thank you, Sophie," Clara said. Sophie reached out one careful finger and touched Benjamin's hand. He grabbed it immediately with the indiscriminate grip of a newborn, and Sophie's face changed, just broke open wide, and wondering the way a child's face does when the world shows them something they didn't know it contained. "He's strong," she whispered. "He is," Clara said. "Like a stone," Sophie said. Clara pressed her lips together. "Yes," she said. "Just like that." Tom appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. His face was doing several things simultaneously, none of them dust-related. "Tom," Ethan said. "Yeah," Tom said. His voice was not steady. "Come in." Tom came in. He looked at Clara and the twins, and Sophie still holding Benjamin's finger. And he looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at him. And 18 years of working this land together was in that look, all the hard seasons, and the losses, and the stubborn refusals to stop. And now this. "Your father," Tom said. He stopped, tried again. "He would have been proud, Ethan." Ethan put his hand on Tom's shoulder for a moment, said nothing. Some things didn't need it. Clara's eyes met his across the room. She was holding both babies, and she looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at everything from the first day, clear-eyed, direct, completely unafraid. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the double W held them all, the 6-year-old with her finger in a newborn's fist. The old foreman who was absolutely not crying. The two tiny people who would grow up knowing this land was theirs. And two people who had signed a contract in a banker's office and built something neither of them had known to ask for. That evening, after the doctor had gone and Tom had gone to the bunkhouse, and Sophie was asleep with both hands folded under her cheek, and the particular expression of a child who has used up every feeling she had, Clara lay in the half-dark with Benjamin and Rose asleep in the cradle beside her, and Ethan sitting in the chair by the window. "Agnes is going to write again," Clara said. "Let her," Ethan said. "She's going to say twins are a hardship. Agnes," Ethan said, "has never run a cattle ranch." "No," Clara agreed. "She hasn't." She was quiet for a moment. She could hear the June night outside the cottonwoods, the cattle settling, the particular breathing of the double W that she knew now the way she knew her own heartbeat. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "The school teacher from Boston who nobody wanted." He looked at her. "She's doing all right," Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. At her face in the low light, which was tired and certain, and fully completely at home. "She's doing a whole lot better than all right," he said. Clara closed her eyes. Outside, the double W breathed in the summer dark. The land that Ethan's father had built from nothing, that Harold Finch had tried to steal, that Clara Whitmore had walked into with $17 and walked out of as something entirely different, and it held them all the way. Good land holds the people who are willing to fight for it and stay. They had fought, they had stayed. And what they had built out of a forced marriage and a foreclosure notice and a firm handshake at a stage depot was exactly what both of them had needed, and neither of them had known to ask for. That was enough. That was everything.